Lauren Tewes was the heart of the Love Boat. Every week, she welcomed millions of viewers aboard with that familiar smile. Kind, confident, and always in control. But what fans never knew was that behind the scenes, Lauren was unraveling. And there's one episode she still refuses to watch. Not because of what happened in the script, but because of what was happening to her off-camera. A moment so personal, so painful, it left a mark she never fully recovered from. And what she's just admitted about that episode, decades later, has left fans stunned. In the late 1970s, Friday nights meant one thing: the Love Boat. The gentle sway of the ocean, the parade of guest stars, the promise of romance and laughter aboard a cruise ship bound for somewhere warm and carefree. It was television escapism at its finest. And at the center of it all stood Lauren Tewes, the smiling, steady cruise director who became one of the most beloved faces on American TV. Her character, Julie McCoy, was everything the show needed her to be: friendly, charming, endlessly composed. She greeted guests, solved problems, played matchmaker, and anchored the emotional rhythm of the ensemble cast. While Captain Steubing was the authority figure, and Isaac and Doc provided the laughs, it was Julie who held the whole ship together. She was the human connection, the heart of the Pacific Princess. And for many fans, she was the reason they tuned in every week. Lauren Tewes was cast in the role at just 24 years old. Relatively unknown at the time, she beat out more experienced actresses for the part by bringing something fresh, something the producers described as natural and warm. That warmth translated perfectly to screen. Audiences fell in love with Julie almost immediately, and Lauren became a household name almost overnight. In interviews from those early years, Lauren always appeared grateful, charming, poised, and aware that she was living a rare kind of Hollywood dream. She once said, "It's like winning the lottery and then getting invited to host the party." But the pace was relentless. Filming The Love Boat was no small feat each week. The cast had to interact with rotating celebrity guest stars, adapt to new storylines, and maintain the same upbeat energy no matter what was happening in their own lives. For Lauren, who had never experienced fame before, the pressure began to mount. There was the pressure to stay cheerful, to always smile, to never show fatigue or frustration, even on long days and even longer nights. And then there was the emotional whiplash of going from unknown to famous in what felt like seconds. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. And they didn't just say hello, they acted like they knew her. Because, in a way, they did. She was in their living rooms every Friday night, week after week. But behind the perfect hair and warm smile, something darker was brewing. Few people knew that Lauren had started struggling with personal demons. The very visibility that made her a star also made it harder to ask for help. She was expected to be Julie McCoy, on screen and off. And there was no space to say, "I'm not okay." And so, she carried it quietly. The cracks didn't show on camera, but they were there. And years later, when she finally opened up about her story, fans would look back on one particular episode. An episode where everything looked normal, where Julie smiled and laughed and comforted passengers, and realize something was different. Because while the rest of the cast was acting, Lauren was living something else entirely. And that episode, the one she's never been able to rewatch, it wasn't the story, it wasn't the plot, it was what was happening behind the scenes. From the outside, The Love Boat was everything television was meant to be in the late 1970s. Light, romantic, comforting, and consistent. For viewers, it was a weekly vacation, a safe space where no problem was too big and no heart too broken. But for Lauren Tewes, the actress behind the ever-cheerful Julie McCoy, the reality behind the scenes was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The fame came fast. Lauren had gone from working in theater and struggling for roles to becoming one of the most visible young women on television. And with that visibility came expectations not just to perform on screen, but to uphold the image of the wholesome, dependable cruise director off-screen as well. She once described it as being two people at once. There was Lauren, the young actress with dreams and flaws and a life to live. And then there was Julie McCoy, the flawless cruise director who never got tired, never got angry, never fell apart, and the line between them began to blur. The pace of production didn't help. Episodes were filmed back-to-back with very little downtime. Each week brought in new guest stars, often big names with egos and complications. The cast had to adjust to constantly changing storylines and personalities, and as the emotional center of the show, Lauren had to remain upbeat, no matter what was going on in her personal life. And behind that smile, Lauren was struggling. The attention from the public was overwhelming. She couldn't go out in public without being recognized, often mistaken for her character. Fans would approach her and expect her to behave like Julie, warm, open, endlessly patient. And while she was grateful for the love, it left her feeling trapped in a role she couldn't step out of. Worse still, the production environment wasn't as warm as it seemed. Lauren later hinted that she often felt isolated on set. While she had genuine friendships with some of her co-stars, others were less supportive. There was a pressure to perform, to keep quiet about personal struggles, to show up cheerful and camera-ready no matter what. And over time, it wore her down. Then came the coping. Quiet at first, barely noticeable. But as the stress built, Lauren turned to substances to numb the pressure. It wasn't unusual in Hollywood in the 1980s. Cocaine was everywhere, on sets, at parties, even in dressing rooms. And for someone trying to keep up with a version of herself that wasn't sustainable, it felt like a shortcut. A way to keep smiling when everything inside was unraveling. At first, no one noticed. She was still hitting her marks, still delivering lines, still playing the perfect cruise director. But eventually, the cracks began to show. Missed cues, late arrivals, a sadness in her eyes that didn't match the script. The producers were patient at first, but in an industry where the show must go on, patience only goes so far. Lauren's struggle remained mostly behind closed doors. The public never knew. Viewers still saw Julie McCoy, sunny, poised, reliable. But for Lauren, each episode was becoming harder to film. The pressure to pretend was exhausting, and eventually it reached a breaking point. There was one episode, 1 week on set, where everything came to a head. She doesn't talk about the details, but she said, many years later, that it was the first time she realized she couldn't go on like that. The cameras were rolling. She was smiling, but inside, she knew it was over. It's that episode, the one where everything looked normal to everyone else, that she still refuses to watch. Because it wasn't just another installment of a feel-good TV show. It was the moment her real life collided with the character the world wouldn't let her stop being. For decades, fans of The Love Boat have speculated. Which episode was it? Which one made Lauren Tewes walk away from the screen and never look back? She's never named it outright. She's never confirmed the title, the guest stars, or the air date. But what she has shared is that it was the moment she broke. The moment she could no longer pretend that Julie McCoy, the perfect, polished cruise director, was a mask she could keep wearing. Lauren described it in later interviews only in fragments. She recalled arriving late to set that week. Her lines weren't sticking. Her hands were shaking between takes. And even though she still smiled when the director called action, her heart was somewhere else entirely. She was ashamed, not just of what was happening to her, but of how hard she was trying to hide it. There were scenes filmed on the deck of the ship, full of sunlight and laughter and upbeat music. But inside, Lauren felt like she was sinking. She knew the episode would air weeks later, and that millions would see it and think everything was fine. And that's precisely why she can't bear to rewatch it. Because the audience saw the version of her that was still performing. But Lauren remembers the version that was falling apart just out of frame. She remembers the moments between takes, when she leaned against a wall to steady herself, when a makeup artist had to quietly fix tears that weren't in the script, when a co-star gave her a look that said, without words, "Are you okay?" She wasn't, and she knew it. There was a scene in that episode, one she recalled years later, though never in full detail, where Julie comforts a heartbroken guest. The dialogue was classic Love Boat fare, light but sincere. The kind of comforting moment that made audiences fall in love with Julie in the first place. But for Lauren, the words stung, because she couldn't offer that kind of comfort to herself. Because in that moment, she felt like a fraud. She said that while filming that scene, she looked into the guest actor's eyes and realized she wasn't acting anymore. The pain was real. The fatigue, the emotional weight, it was all bleeding through. And when the director yelled, "Cut," she didn't reset. She didn't bounce back. Something shifted. That was the moment she knew she had to step away. The episode aired like any other. There was no hint to the audience that anything was wrong. No breaking of the illusion. But for Lauren, it became the one episode she couldn't revisit. Not because of anything in the script, but because it had captured something too raw, too real. Years later, she admitted that she's only seen clips. Someone once showed her a scene from that episode at a reunion, and she said she felt her stomach drop. "That wasn't acting," she whispered. "That was me, barely holding it together." It's easy to forget, watching reruns or seeing glossy photos of the cast, that television history is full of moments like this, where actors hide their truth in plain sight, and the camera never catches the cost. For Lauren Tewes, that one episode became a time capsule, not of Julie McCoy, but of herself, of who she was before everything changed. And that's why, all these years later, even though fans still ask her about it, she refuses to watch it. Because it's not just an episode, it's a goodbye. When Lauren Tewes finally stepped away from the Love Boat, there was no dramatic exit written into the script. No heartfelt farewell for Julie McCoy. No storyline to explain her absence. She simply disappeared, quietly, and without explanation. One week she was there, the next, she wasn't. And for longtime fans, it felt like something was missing. The show went on, of course. The Pacific Princess kept sailing. New storylines unfolded. Guest stars came and went. But the heart of the ship, Julie, was gone. And though producers eventually brought in a replacement cruise director, it never felt the same. Behind the scenes, the decision had already been made. Lauren's personal struggles had begun to impact production. She was showing up late, forgetting lines, struggling to maintain the polished energy that had made Julie McCoy so beloved. The producers, faced with tight schedules and mounting pressure, chose to let her go. The public story was vague. At the time, no official statement was made about Lauren's departure. There were whispers in the press, rumors of creative differences, health issues, and the usual coded language Hollywood uses when it doesn't want to say too much. But the truth was more personal. Lauren was battling addiction, and instead of support, she got silence. In the decades since, Lauren has spoken about this period with a mix of regret and honesty. She never blamed the show, never pointed fingers. But it's clear that the culture of the time, the expectation to stay quiet, to keep smiling, to handle personal pain off-screen, played a role in her unraveling. She was, after all, just 27 years old when the pressures of fame collided with the instability of addiction. And in the late 70s and early 80s, there was no roadmap for young women in Hollywood who needed help. Vulnerability was seen as weakness. Asking for support was often a one-way ticket to replacement. Lauren later described her firing not as a betrayal, but as a consequence I earned. But there's a sorrow in her words, a sense that if she'd been given space, if she'd been able to say, "I'm struggling," without fear of losing everything, maybe things would have turned out differently. Instead, she retreated. For years, she stepped out of the spotlight. She entered treatment. She focused on healing, on rebuilding her life out of view of the cameras that once loved her. And though she returned to acting later with guest roles and voiceover work, it was never quite the same. The shine of the Love Boat was gone, and with it, the version of Lauren Tewes the world once knew. What makes her story all the more heartbreaking is how easily it could have been another Hollywood cautionary tale. A young actress chewed up and forgotten. A star who rose too fast and burned too quickly. But Lauren didn't let that happen. She chose to survive. And in doing so, she gave her story a second act. Not the glamorous kind with lights and red carpets, but a quieter, stronger kind of resilience. She turned her pain into purpose, speaking candidly about addiction and recovery. She shared her truth not for sympathy, but for connection. For those who had also fallen, and needed to hear that they could get back up. Still, she has never revisited that one episode. The one that marked the beginning of the end. Not because she's ashamed, but because it captured her at her most fragile. Hollywood didn't give her a goodbye, so that episode became it. Her silent exit, her unspoken farewell. And even now, all these years later, she's never pressed play. In the years since The Love Boat, Lauren Tewes rebuilt her life, not on the decks of a glamorous cruise ship, but through quiet perseverance and personal growth. Her story, once defined by fame and a painful fall from grace, has transformed into something far more enduring, a story of survival. After leaving the show, Lauren entered rehab and began the difficult work of recovery. She didn't do it with cameras rolling or with a publicist at her side. She did it privately, deliberately, and with the full awareness that the industry she once belonged to might never invite her back in. But that wasn't her focus anymore. She studied culinary arts. She took acting classes not to become a star again, but because she still loved the craft. She started performing in theater, away from the bright lights and television sets, in roles that allowed her to be something other than Julie McCoy. She embraced anonymity as a form of freedom. And with time, she began to open up not just to friends, but to fans. In interviews later in life, Lauren began speaking about her past more candidly. She didn't dramatize it or seek sympathy. Instead, she offered something far more powerful: honesty. She talked about the isolation that comes with fame, about the fear of not living up to a persona, about how addiction doesn't always look like a spiral. It can look like a smile, like a woman showing up on set, doing her job, hitting her marks, while quietly falling apart. For many who heard her story, especially those who had watched The Love Boat in their own moments of need, her vulnerability felt like a full-circle moment. Julie McCoy had always been the steady one, the helper, the caretaker, and now Lauren was reminding fans that even the strongest need support. She became a quiet advocate for those battling addiction. She reminded people that healing doesn't come from pretending everything's fine. It comes from telling the truth, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And yet, for all her growth, for all her courage in speaking out, there's one thing she hasn't been able to do. She still won't watch that episode. The one where everything was collapsing behind the scenes. The one that aired like any other week, full of laughter and love stories, while Lauren was holding back tears between takes. When asked why she avoids it, she gave a simple answer: because it was the moment I realized I wasn't okay, and I didn't know how to say it. And that's what stays with fans. Not just the performance or the character or the glamour of the cruise ship, but the quiet pain of a young woman carrying more than anyone knew, and the strength it took to walk away from something the world loved, because she needed to save herself. In the end, Lauren's legacy isn't just Julie McCoy. It's everything that came after. The courage to come clean, the refusal to stay silent, the way she turned a breakdown into a turning point. Millions still watch The Love Boat. The reruns play on cable, the nostalgia lives on. And every time Julie walks onto the deck, clipboard in hand and smile on her face, it's easy to forget what Lauren was going through. But now, those who know the truth watch differently. They don't just see a cruise director, they see a survivor. And maybe that's the most powerful legacy of all. Lauren Tewes never got the farewell she deserved on The Love Boat. There was no grand send-off, no final scene for Julie McCoy, just silence. But sometimes the most powerful goodbyes aren't spoken on screen. They live in the quiet decisions we make when no one's watching. Like walking away, like getting help, like refusing to relive the moment everything almost broke you. For fans who grew up watching her every Friday night, Lauren's story is a reminder that real strength doesn't always look like the characters we loved. It often lives in the people who played them. Behind the perfect hair and smile was a young woman who lost herself, and then found her way back on her own terms. She may never press play on that one episode. And maybe that's okay, because what Lauren Tewes gave us week after week, line after line, wasn't just entertainment. It was heart. And the fact that she's still here, still standing, still telling her truth, that's the real ending. For more emotional stories, check out this video.